in the series and is hosted by the Diplomacy Training Program in partnership with Youth Law Australia and Australian Lawyers for Human Rights and the Global Compact Network. If you're new to the series, just a bit of a background to it. The webinars cover various aspects of the conversation around the Convention on the Rights of the Child, CRC, in discussion with Australian and international child rights experts. Before we progress any further, as a considerable number of our attendees today are based in Australia, I would like to begin by an acknowledgement of a country, which purpose is to recognize Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the traditional custodians of the land on which many of us are currently based, and to pay my respect to the elders past, present, and emerging, as well as the youth who have an important voice in shaping our future. I'm joining today from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and my name is Natalia Shablewska, and I'll have the pleasure of moderating today's webinar. I'm the chair of Business and Human Rights Subcommittee of Australian Lawyers for Human Rights, ALHR for short, which is a non-governmental organization with over 2,000 members that brings together legal professionals active in practicing and promoting awareness of international human rights standards in Australia. It's worth pointing out that ALHR is run entirely by volunteers and funded exclusively by the generous donations from the public. So besides being involved in the work of ALHR for the last 8 years, I'm a professor in law and society at the Open University in the UK with further academic affiliated positions in Cambodia, Australia, and New Zealand. And I'm also a member of the Modern Slavery Leadership Advisory Group to the New Zealand government. So I have really strong interest in business and human rights in general, and in particular at the impact of corporate action on the most vulnerable in the society. Hence, as I mentioned in the beginning, it's a real pleasure for me to be part of today's webinar. Before I introduce our speakers for today, very quick housekeeping. Please mute sound if you're not already on mute, and your image. And please make sure you participate actively in this webinar, and you can do so by posting your questions in the chat area, or raise your hand if you wish to use your microphone. And you could do it that way. And also any materials and additional links that we're going to be referring to today, they're going to be posted in the chat area as well. So please keep an eye on that. Right, so let me introduce our wonderful speakers tonight, Surya Deva and Ida Hillstead. Professor Deva is professor at Macquarie University Law School, that's Sydney, Australia, and he served as a member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, and has advised UN agencies, governments, national human rights institutions, multinational corporations, trade unions, and civil society organizations on issues related to business and human rights. Surya will be in conversation today with Ida, and Ida Hillstead is the Regional Child Rights and Business Manager for UNICEF in East Asia and the Pacific, and she led the development of UNICEF's global strategy to address adverse child rights impacts by business, and has also shaped UNICEF's work on child safeguarding in business, child rights in investment decision making, as well as the family-friendly policies agenda. Just to give a little bit of a context to today's webinar, the webinar focuses on the responsibilities of business in relation to children and their rights under the CRC. This is obviously a topic of importance at any point and any time, but especially today, as the webinar coincides with the 10th anniversary of the children's rights in business principles. And the principles that have been developed by UNICEF, UN Global Compact, and Save the Children are an important part of the wider agenda that aims to encourage and prescribe businesses in the private sector to uphold human rights and to ensure that the corporate action support the implementation of human rights. For any of you who have been part of or been working in the area of business and human rights, you're going to be well familiar with a number of guidelines and tools already being developed over the years to guide businesses, private sector, predominantly but not exclusively in this area. So we're talking here about the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, that is UNGPs, that set out the responsibilities of the companies to respect human rights and to exercise due diligence in doing so. We also have the OECD and guidelines for multinational enterprises. And over the years, OECD has developed a number of specific guidance for for specific sectors. In addition, we obviously have multiple codes of conduct for different industries. So all of those are part of the wider agenda that encourages companies to ensure that they protect, respect, and remedy harms to human rights by business activities. And the children's rights and business principles are provided as framework for business to respect and to support children's rights in the business context. So I have now a pleasure to invite Surya and Ida to provide us with an update on the progress, but also gaps in the implementation of both the UNGPs and also the children's rights and business principles. Surya, over to you.
Thank you very much, Natalia. I hope everyone can hear me. And I would also like to acknowledge the Vanuatu clan of Darug Nation, the unceded territory on which land the Macquarie University is. And I would like to pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. So, colleagues, we're going to have kind of a dialogue, Ida and I. I will start with UN guiding principles, and then I'll pass it on to Ida. She will talk about the CRC, the children's rights and business principles, and also General Comment 16. And we try to make connection between these different instruments and how do they fit in the context of business and human rights, and what should businesses and governments be doing. So as you may know, UN guiding principles were adopted in June 2011. So they are 11 years young. So we can say UN guiding principles are also child because they are below 18 years, right? And I'm not aware of many other international instruments that have been so influential in such a short span of time in making an impact on law and policy all over the world in the space of business and human rights and beyond, because they are trying to shape the issues about environmental law, rights of the child, as we are discussing today, as well as climate change. Now, there are three pillars. Pillar one is the duty of states to protect human rights against abuses by businesses. Pillar two, which is the focus of the webinar today, is on the business responsibility to respect human rights. And the third pillar is about access to remedy when the violations cannot be prevented. UN guiding principles, in my view, are critical for many regions, but I would just like to mention three of them. First of all, they highlight that businesses have an independent responsibility to respect human rights, which is beyond legal regulations. So whatever the legal framework is in a particular country or at the international level, that is not enough. Beyond that, you need to respect human rights, all human rights under the UN guiding principles. Secondly, they apply to all businesses operating anywhere in the world. So it doesn't really matter whether you're multinational or you're a small cafe or you're informal business or you're operating in a particular sector of garment or extractives. It doesn't really matter. All types of businesses operating anywhere are captured. And thirdly, they cover all human rights of everyone. And that will, of course, include rights of the child, right? At the same time, some of you, if you read the UN guiding principles, you may notice that the word child or children is found only 2 times in the entire document. That is in the commentary to Principle 3 and commentary to Principle 12. For instance, Principle 12 commentary talks about that there may be additional standards that businesses may need to follow. And I think then children are mentioned as an example of those additional standards that businesses may need to follow, right? So I think we should not, of course, see the rights of the child as a separate compartment, because there are interesting interlinkages, in my view, between rights of the child and others. For instance, if a business does not pay living wage, this is going to impact children. If domestic violence is taking place in a particular family, that is going to impact children. So even if the violence is not directly directed towards children. So I think we should not see these as compartments: rights of the child, rights of women, rights of persons with disabilities, so on and so forth, because there are those intersectionalities and those connections, which is very crucial. Yet, in my view, the focus on the rights of the child is crucial. And I will just mention 3 points and then pass it on to Ida to unpack it further specifically. First of all, children have different needs, and the impacts of business activities on children could be different. Let us take displacement from a particular village where a particular development project is going to unfold. This is going to impact everyone, but children are going to be impacted very differently from adults who are displaced, because they might have their small friends and it may be difficult to build that bonding easily. So they may have different challenges. If children are denied early education, that impact is going to be very different as compared to, let us say, adults not able to access university education or food. If you don't get nutrition at early age, the impact on your health is going to be very, very significant. And I can go on. Conflict, for instance. Children are going to be impacted very differently in a situation like conflict, like let's say what is happening in Ukraine now, right? The second issue is access to remedy, which I mentioned to you, Pillar 3. If you look at most of the access to remedy mechanisms, judicial or non-judicial, are they sensitive to the needs and experiences of children if they want to seek remedies for their violations of human rights? I think that is another issue. And thirdly, we should not see children, in my view, merely as a part of a vulnerable group. They also have agency. They should be able to have a say in what should be happening about them and their rights. And I think that provides me excellent opportunity to bring Ida. And Ida, over to you, if you can walk us through about the CRC, the Children's Right in Business Principles, and General Comment 16, and then we take it from there. So you have the floor now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Surya. It is always an honor to get to talk more about the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the Children's Rights and Business Principles in your company. And also thanks to DTP and UN Global Compact and Natalia. So yes, as already mentioned by Natalia, it's such an exciting moment this year, since we're celebrating the 10-year anniversary of the Children's Rights and Business Principles. And it provides us with such an important opportunity to really reflect on the progress and continued challenges we see when we talk about children's rights in the context of business policies and practices. And before going into the CSC, I do want to just emphasize the points that Surya just made in terms of like why it's important that we apply this child rights lens as well to responsible business conduct and the UN guiding principles. It's really because virtually all children are impacted one way or another by business activity every single day, be it as consumers of products, of services, exposure to marketing, advertising, as young workers themselves, or as child laborers, or as the children of workers, or as we see now with the digital penetration in terms of the users of digital platforms, or through these environments where they live and play both online and offline. And the point that Surya also made about it is also that children also depend on their parents or on other caregivers and the wider community. So when those people are facing challenges or hardships, children also face challenges and hardships. But let me turn into the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is, of course, the primary international instrument we have in setting the standards for the protection and promotion of the rights of the child. And the issue around the CRC, though, is that it does not explicitly nor systematically address the role of the state in protecting children's rights in the context of business operations. Of course, we have certain provisions that do so by implication. For example, Article 32 requiring states to protect children from economic exploitation and so forth. But there is a need for other unpacking and interpretation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child to fully understand the implications in terms of the state duty to protect the child in the context of business activities, which is why, in addition to the UN guiding principles, which Surya mentioned, we also have the Children's Rights and Business Principles and the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child General Comment 16. Which can help guide our work and understanding of the need to protect children in the context of business activities. So let me start with the Children's Rights and Business Principles. So they were officially launched in March of 2012 as a result of an extensive consultation process, and they were developed in a joint collaboration between Save the Children and UN Global Compact and UNICEF. And these principles call on the entire business community to avoid infringing upon, that means to respect, and to take voluntary actions to advance, so that is the support element of children's rights in the workplace, in the marketplace, and in the community, as well as the environment. And these 10 principles are a guide for business to uphold this full spectrum of children's rights through policy commitments, through due diligence, through remediation, and also further actions. And so, as already mentioned, they're really important because they provide a child rights lens to the global standard, which was established by the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And they set the tone for how children are both rights holders, but also stakeholders of business. And importantly, these principles can also be used to inform governments' expectations of an engagement with business, which we'll come to shortly when Surya talks about national action plans and mandatory human rights due diligence. But before turning to that, I did also want to mention the UN CRC General Comment 16, because against the backdrop of both the UN Guiding Principles, the Children's Rights and Business Principles, the Committee on the Rights of the Child set out to provide governments with authoritative guidance on how to regulate, to influence, and to engage with the private sector to make sure that companies respect children's rights. And to do this, the committee launched a series of both online and in-person consultations to build a broad consensus for this work. And as a result of this, they adopted General Comment number 16 on state obligations regarding the impact of the business sector on children's rights, and that was back in 2013. And again, it addresses all states and covers all national and transnational business enterprises, so all businesses as well. And of course, the main thrust of the Global Compact, General Comment 16, is that states have a legal obligation to ensure that the private sector enterprises respect the right of the child and that they do not hinder efforts to realize and advance children's rights, either directly or indirectly, intentionally or inadvertently. And also that they engage positively in the realization of those rights. But so what does all of that translate into in terms of in practice? And so we have a set of tools, and I know that Claire will put some of these in the comment box too. So UNICEF together with the ICJ have developed an operational guidance for governments on how the General Comment 16 can be implemented at the country level. And another publication worth highlighting is, which has been produced by the Danish Institute for Human Rights and International Corporate Accountability Roundtable and UNICEF, which is guidance for how children's rights can be addressed in national action plans on business and human rights, as well as other similar policies. But on that note, let me hand back over to Professor Surya to speak more about what are these national action plans and what is the importance of them in the context of business and human rights. Over to you, Surya.
Thank you, Ida. That was very useful overview of connecting the dots between a number of instruments, right? So that kind of reinforce the ideas in the UN guiding principles, but also go beyond in some situations, and I think which is very crucial. Now, the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights has made a recommendation that how can guiding principles be implemented? And I think they have suggested that one key tool to implement UN guiding principles is to adopt a national action plan on business and human rights. So neither Australia nor New Zealand have adopted one yet. Both have committed politically that they will do so, but I think let us hope they move in this particular direction going forward. So far, 26 countries have adopted standalone national action plans, and 3 countries have a chapter on business and human rights in their generic human rights action plan. So that is about 30 countries, let us say. But there are several more which are in the process of adopting a national action plan on business and human rights. Now, if you look at the content of these national action plans, most of them will focus on rights of children, or youth. But they are not very robust in terms of engaging with the impact of General Comment 16, or in terms of looking at specifically the children's rights and business principles, for instance, or sometimes they don't even mention expressly CRC, which Ida mentioned, right? And I think that shows that sometimes if that lens is not applied, then the protection of the rights of the children in those policy documents is not very robust. Rather, it is just tokenistic, that you are merely making a reference to children or rights of the child. So I think that is my first observation based on the impression of these national action plans. But perhaps the more crucial point that I would like to raise, Ida, for your consideration, for consideration of others, is that to what extent children are able to participate in the process of developing a national action plan. Is this a national action plan about children, or is it a national action plan about someone else? And if it is about children, what steps the government ministries and other actors are taking to involve children directly, to work with organizations who are focusing on the rights of the child, and the UN agencies like UNICEF, of course. So I think that engagement, that process of meaningful consultation, in my view, is very crucial. And I think that meaningful consultation should not be limited to merely developing a national action plan. Rather, it should also extend to how do we implement the national action plan? How do we track the implementation process? All these points. The other thing that I would like to mention is about, can we try to break silos? Because rights of the children are also relevant in the context of SDGs. So how could a national action plan on business and human rights break those compartments and bring this cohesive policy framework, which is relevant not only in the context of UN guiding principles or OECD guidelines or ILO declaration, but it is also relevant in the context of, let us say, SDGs, in the context of climate change, or in the context of emerging technologies. Ida mentioned about the rise of technologies. And of course, normally, children are far more involved in technologies. Like my sons know much more about technology than me. And I guess that is not an exception. That is perhaps likely to be the case. So what I'm trying to suggest here is that the lens that has been applied so far on these national action plans, as well as the mandatory human rights due diligence legislation that are in existence in Europe mostly, or the Modern Slavery Act in UK, and now the New Zealand government is drafting one. In my assessment, they are not applying their children lens in a very robust manner. And I think that is perhaps not ideal situation. And that is where I would say policymakers and the government officials and others who are drafting those documents, whether it is the policy documents or drafting these legislation, they need to understand those differences and be responsive and sensitive to those differences. So for instance, if you look at the Modern Slavery Act in Australia, we know that children, especially in supply chains, are a key potential target. They are more vulnerable to modern slavery. But what is the law doing to apply this particular lens? I think that is the thing we should be asking, right? Anyway, so I would like to bring back Ida, you again. We are talking about what should the governments be doing in terms of NAP or mandatory human rights due diligence laws and all that. But what about businesses? Because pillar 2 means that they have independent responsibility. UNICEF works closely with businesses. And I know later on, Kylie will also jump in from the UN Global Compact Australia to share more. But if Ida, you can start first about any one or two examples, how businesses are engaging with the rights of child. So you have the floor now. Thank you.
Thank you, Surya, and thank you for these important points. And yes, I think so. Actually, when we look over the past 10 years, then we see the progress of the children's rights and business principles and the adoption and uptake of them. We see that we have been able to develop a lot of guidance for companies on how to minimize their impacts, negative impacts on children's rights, and how to maximize their positive impacts. And we have this suite of tools and guidance for companies across different sectors as well, from the ICT sector to marketing and advertising companies, to the food and beverage sector, to extractive companies. And so we have all this guidance that are available. And we do see that some companies are taking voluntary actions to use these and to apply this child rights lens to their due diligence processes. But I think we're very far from the scale and pace of this shift in corporate behavior that we're really looking to see in order to see transformational change. And in order to ensure that business respects every children everywhere. So while we are, of course, hugely encouraging of companies to take these voluntary steps and actions, it needs to be coupled with the mandatory human rights due diligence. And this is really globally significant in terms of ensuring that the human rights due diligence mechanisms are implemented at national, regional, and international level. Because only then really we'll see the full potential of the UN guiding principles in action. And I hear this is something you mentioned as well in terms of, I think it's really important that we need to get regulatory clarity and predictability in what is expected of business in terms of prevention of adverse business impact. And that's when the governments need to really bring the lens of the CRC into the design of business-related policy and legislation. But also coming to what you asked for, Surya, in terms of concrete examples, I mean, we do, of course, see examples of when companies themselves take action, but or business associations take action. And I did want to mention one example from the region, which I think is really interesting, where through our office in Indonesia, we have had a close collaboration with the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, which the RSPO, which is the global multi-stakeholder initiative that develops and implements global standards for sustainable palm oil production. And we have been working with them in order to incorporate much stronger safeguards for children's rights as part of their certification process, but also to support the palm oil companies in Indonesia to minimize the harmful impacts that they have on children and their families, which we had found evidence of in initial research on how children were impacted by the palm oil industry. And through this work, we have been able to then, through the evidence we have generated around child rights impacts, we've been able to influence the Roundtable's principles and criteria. And that basically means that the palm oil companies are now required to implement child protection systems, including trainings on staff on child rights and child safeguarding. We see new provisions around maternity leave and employment contracts, the establishment of gender committees, a ban of pesticide spraying for adolescent workers and nursing and pregnant women. So that's just an example of where you can see when a business industry association takes steps to integrate specific child rights indicators into their standards and principles that guide the behavior of their member companies. And those are the kind of examples that are so important to start shifting towards more of a scale in terms of impact on how we can see changes. Of course, we also have very specific examples around family-friendly workplace policies, which is such an important agenda for us. Basically, the way that conditions so the way conditions of employment impact on the well-being of workers, of children and families is huge. And so from work that we've been doing in factories in Bangladesh and Vietnam, but also the work in the palm oil plantation in Indonesia, we know that it is really those most vulnerable families that lack affordable childcare or who have limited protections or opportunities to breastfeed their infants. Or as you mentioned already, Surya, the low wages, the long working hours, children who are left behind. So we're really aware of the importance of the introduction of family-friendly policies, including employment, income protection, paid leave and care for family members, flexible working arrangements, access to quality emergency childcare, how all of those measures can really help workers to protect and care for themselves, but more importantly, also their children. So those are also initiatives that we work concretely with businesses on to introduce. And interestingly enough, this is a case where even though I don't necessarily believe that you need a business case because you should do what is the right thing to do, as you also mentioned in terms of your first point about why the UN Guiding Principles are so important in terms of that independent responsibility of business to respect human rights. It doesn't need a business case, but what we do see is from our work in factory settings is that there is actually an increase in retention rates, and that the factories are actually able to save money through investment in basic family-friendly policy provisions for their workers, because they no longer have to invest in these huge training programs of new workers, for example. So it's just to say that there is also a business case for ensuring that the well-being of workers and their children are taken care of. But I think I will conclude here because I know I'll hand over to Natalia because I know we have a lot of questions coming up and we have a few more speakers as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Surya and Ida. That's been extremely helpful in setting the scene, if you like, and your very insightful examples of what happens in the field, where we are, where we're heading, where we should be. I'm gonna now turn to Kylie Porter, who's the Executive Director of Global Compact Network Australia, and I'd like to invite her to reflect from a business perspective on the implementation, the impact of UNGPs and the children's rights and business principles. And so what does that mean in practice? What can we learn so far, and what kind of good models and example practices we can share in this space? Kylie, over to you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for that nice introduction, Natalia, and good to hear from Ida and Surya as well. It's quite interesting hearing this discussion. I used to work for Save the Children in Australia, and this is when there were an awful lot of discussions even back then, which would be at least 6 years ago now, 6 or 7 years ago now, about how to integrate these principles into business. And it's interesting because it's a tough discussion, and I think if I'm somewhat critical, but in a fair way, some of the ways in which the principles are written do make it incredibly difficult for businesses to implement them completely without having concerns about potential liability in the future. I think, there's a few points, that I'd like to call out. And firstly, Soraya did a great job about talking about the UNGPs at the start. And the fact that the UNGPs do actually, go above the minimum that we see set by most businesses, particularly around respecting the rights of individuals, to Soraya's point, those around including children. But it's fair to say the maturity in the UNGPs is really still lacking. I think in Australia, and that's where I can predominantly lend my views, in Australia, the introduction of the Modern Slavery Act and then the subsequent introduction of a National Action Plan on Modern Slavery and Human Trafficking have definitely increased the awareness of business to take policy action on modern slavery, on broader human rights and subsequently human rights. Obviously, and to Soraya's point too, in Australia, the Modern Slavery Act is more focused on eradicating child labour. It doesn't bring necessarily a child rights lens to all of those areas of the policy. Having said that, there is a lack of understanding around how to engage with children, a lack of understanding from civil society groups about how they can support businesses in engaging better with children. but also the grievance mechanisms. Grievance mechanisms are difficult enough for an employee to understand, or an external supplier or other form of relationship to understand, let alone how you bring children into understanding and using a grievance mechanism. So there's an awful lot of work to be done there, but I think we need to also, be conscious of the things that have changed. The understanding of the UN guiding principles has increased immensely over the last 5 years, and we're seeing so many more companies now with human rights policies. We're seeing companies introduce modern slavery statements, but with a more thorough understanding about what that means in their responsibility to respect human rights. But we're also seeing governments take a bigger stance on their requirement, to protect human rights. In Australia, many of you might be aware that our Modern Slavery Act is currently under review. At the moment, the definition of modern slavery in terms of children does respond to the worst forms of child labour. It gives effect to the Convention of the Rights of the Child. It gives effect to the ILO Convention on the elimination of the worst forms of child labour. It follows the Global Compact's principles under Principle 5 of our 10 principles, and it also incorporates elements of the SDGs. But again, at the moment, this only covers businesses with revenue of above 100 million Australian dollars. So there is a huge area of, a huge group of businesses that are probably not doing the right thing in terms of child rights, or probably wouldn't even have an awareness of the Convention of the Rights of the Child, let alone the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, or the Sustainable Development Goals for that matter. Having said that, and sorry, Natalia, I've kind of blurbed on a little bit, but having said that, we do see some good practices happening. And, Ikea, I think, is a good example here. When I worked for Save the Children in Australia, the Ikea Foundation was a large funder of theirs. They did get accused of child labour in their supply chains back in the 90s, and they still have their global sourcing approach and their code of conduct to eradicate modern slavery, and they are eradicate any child human rights issues in their supply chain. Again, Nestle, they've been incredibly public over the years about the issues that they've faced around child labour, particularly in the Ivory Coast, around palm, the production of cocoa. They've got a really public monitoring and remediation scheme. They've got, public education materials out there that people can follow around modern slavery in their supply chains, and particularly the child labour element. But again, all very, very focused on child labour. And so whilst I don't disagree at all, with Soraya and Ida and the way in which we need to approach child rights, I think we also need to put a lens over what is practical for business at the moment. And the reality is that there is still not an element of maturity amongst most businesses about what their responsibility to respect human rights is. And we need to get that right before we can start going into an awful lot of detail about the triggers that you can pull in terms of in terms of child rights as well, and how that needs to be incorporated more broadly. Now, that's probably the case for the bulk of businesses. There's obviously responses that businesses can put in place with regard to child labour. But I think where we might be able to start seeing some really big differences is a lot of those fast-moving consumer goods companies, particularly the ones where they produce products that are very visible to a consumer market. They can start really thinking about what's their advertising and their marketing with regard to this. Does it actually consider the rights of the child? The ways in which the product is packaged or promoted, does that consider the rights of the child? They're probably quick wins or low-lying fruit that we can work more closely to, but it does get far more difficult, and it is really difficult, particularly at the moment when there's so many other things going on in the world around geopolitical tensions, the recovery from COVID, etc., that I think it's hard to get businesses focused on something that is actually relatively new. So I think this is great that there's a webinar like this that's promoting what the child rights business principles are. We need to start talking about them a lot more, but I think we also need to be realistic that it will take time for companies to really integrate this into their broader human rights strategies. But that's all from me, Natalia. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Kylie. And I'm going to remind participants and audience to post your questions and comments in the chat area. And while you're doing so, I'm going to start with a question. I'm going to utilize my privilege as the moderator for this webinar. And I'm going to start with a difficult one, and exactly building on what we've heard from Surya and Ida and from Kylie here. So in terms of there has been that global movement towards ensuring that we're not only talking about business doing the right thing, but actually incentivizing businesses to do so. And a number of times we've today already mentioned Modern Slavery Act in Australia. There have been similar kind of legislative movements elsewhere in the UK and other countries. Currently at the EU level, there's also been a movement in that space, focusing on mandatory due diligence, both in relation to human rights as well as protection of the environment, or in relation to risk to the environment. And Kylie, you touched on a very important aspect here, because we know what the reality is. We know where we would like to be, but in order to get there, we need to be somehow practical. And so my question is around that. So I think most of us would agree that some form of child rights specific policies developed by businesses is important, because Surya and Ida have highlighted a number of occasions children experience the impact of business activities on children differs. So I don't think that this is necessarily controversial. But how do we, from a practical point of view, ensure that we do not alienate the business sector, but we are in collaboration, in partnership with the business sector, so they understand the practicalities, but also the advantages of ensuring that they have specific policies addressing modern slavery in general terms, but also the kind of the practicalities of what it means for children. So in response to what Kylie has been saying about the practical aspect of it, could I ask Surya and Ida, whichever one of you would like to jump in, and comment from your perspective on the practical aspects of how businesses can address children's rights through the statements, through the policies, whether focusing on modern slavery or through the human rights and environmental due diligence?
I mean, I can perhaps start, if that is okay, Ida, and then you can add what I'm saying. Let me make a couple of points. I think, first of all, we need to raise awareness. I don't think many companies would reject the idea that the rights of the child are crucial and they should respect it. But in many cases, those people who are working in those companies, they don't know how to do it well. First of all, they may not see the connections between what they are doing in a company and how their actions or non-actions are impacting rights of the child. That's the first issue about not appreciating the adverse impacts on children and their rights. Second, how do you address those adverse impacts? And I think that's where the human rights due diligence process becomes crucial. So my overarching point, practical point, is that we need more in terms of raising awareness, building capacity. And I think some of those tools that UNICEF has developed and others have developed, they're useful, but sometimes you can't apply a cut and paste approach in those tools. Every company is different, and different companies in different sectors are going to face different challenges, right? So a social media company, for instance, in which children could be using social media, is going to face a very different challenge as compared to those who are working in the garment sector and those who are working, let us say, in the finance or the banking sector, right? So I think those specific dynamics are crucial, and we need more awareness raising and building capacity of businesses. And we also need to bring those children to the table, in my view, to the discussion table. If a child can speak directly to the chief executive officer of a company in an environment in which we can manage the power imbalance, that would be very powerful. to tell the CEO that why he or she needs to take care of the rights of the children. The other element I would say, which is crucial, is that we need incentives and disincentives at the same time. Merely disincentives like due diligence or punishment and sanctions will not be enough. For instance, can we use public procurement in a more powerful manner to encourage more responsible business behavior? Can we try to reward businesses that are not merely saying, but doing things on rights of the child in terms of preferential loan and tax rebates? How do we build the capacity of SMEs if they need technology, if they need some other resources, right? So I think these are things that are crucial in my view to move in this particular direction. Over to you, Ida.
Thank you, Surya. So actually, just building on what both Kylie and Surya said, I thought I would spotlight some work that has been done by my colleagues in UNICEF Australia, who together with the Ethical Partners Funds Management have recently conducted this very comprehensive benchmarking of all Australian listed companies to better understand this current state of attention to child rights across Australia's listed companies. And so this is the first one. And for the financial year 2021, they benchmarked 214 listed companies. And they use, for the benchmarking methodology, they use the UNICEF tool for investors on integrating children's rights into ESG assessments. But the reason why I'm mentioning this is that it's very interesting because what we found is that there is a long way to go for these companies and how they consider, address, integrate, and report on child rights risks and the opportunities and the impacts. And basically, children's rights are largely overlooked by these companies across all industries in their supply chains as well as operations, beyond a very singular focus on child labor. And so this is interesting that when Australian companies are performing the strongest in child labor policies, and I think we saw that 81% of the companies were publicly disclosing a zero tolerance policy for child labor, and 62% of the companies were doing trainings on the Modern Slavery Act or human rights due diligence. This is, of course, likely a reflection of the Australian legislative changes with the Modern Slavery Act of 2018. So I do think, yes, we need the mandatory human rights due diligence legislation and the drive around that to keep pushing for child rights considerations beyond child labor. Of course, child labor remains a hugely critical issue, and we're only seeing increases in number now in the wake of COVID and economic crisis. But it does mean that we can, maybe it's a bit of a stretch to say there's a direct link between this and the work that has happened around the Modern Slavery Act in Australia, but it does help generate attention, awareness, and the trainings that follow from this work is important in terms of raising awareness beyond the child labor issue. So yes, definitely a need for seeing increased capacity building, increased training on the wider set of child rights issues. And then, I could only agree with what Surya said already. There is a need for incentivization and disincentives as well, which are important. But often sometimes, and I think I referred to this already in relation to, when companies see that it can make sense in terms of worker productivity, worker retention, when those benefits become clear, but also from a risk management point of view, particularly when we see with the digital environment and children's rights and the harms and risk they face online, there is a dire need for companies to take the necessary steps to ensure that children are safe online, and it can also have huge reputational issues if that is not ensured. So it's really a mix of everything, but I see Surya has his hand up already again. Handing back to you.
Yes, Surya, do you want to very quickly come back to it before I ask Kylie whether there's anything she would like to add?
No, that's fine. If Kylie wants, because I was raising hand to answer a couple of questions in the chat box, so I could wait.
So
let's start with Kylie.
Yes, Kylie, is there anything kind of in response, because obviously it's kind of obvious that there's no easy fix, right? Have we had an easy fix, we would have done a long time ago. So this is very complex, and there is a bit of give and take there. So is there anything you would like to add to the point that you made very clearly before, that it is about the practical, what can be done and how soon it can be done?
Yeah, I think that's, that's terribly what it comes down to, is the practicality and how quickly. I mean, I will say that from a human rights perspective, we would never advocate for a company to only have a modern slavery statement, right? One of the reasons why we work very closely with Australian Border Force, who are responsible for the Act, one of the reasons why one of our board members sat on the advisory committee that put together the guidance note was to ensure that we had the UNGPs as central to the guidance for when companies do respond to the Modern Slavery Act. It's really important that we increase the capacity and awareness of the UNGPs more broadly. And once that's better understood, then we can start talking about the absolute, the detail that sits behind that. But those discussions should, of course, include discussions about all stakeholders that fall within a company's periphery. So that does include children. It does include marginalised part of society, etc. So there's definitely a room to start thinking about that. I just think it's a more complex area for businesses to understand, and they haven't traditionally seen this as part of their role, because in fact, if they're thinking about human rights properly, it should be naturally including that. So I don't have any more to add, except I think it's going to unfortunately be a patience game for us to start seeing the language that Soraya and Ida would probably want to see across the business, across the whole business landscape. And sorry, my throat's really croaky today, so apologies for that.
Thank you, Kylie. That is very helpful, obviously, and it really highlights the issue that we are talking about, the holistic approach. This is what we're aiming for, right? So we're not only focusing on specific labor rights or forced labor in relation to children, but also all the full package. And also we need to highlight the intersectionality of the different impacts, right? Which again is very complex areas. And but before I answer, there are a number of questions. Thank you for those who have posted those questions. They are very interesting, very important questions. But I'll let Surya to answer the couple of questions that have been addressed directly to him. And depending on how we are with time, I will then choose one or two from the other questions. Surya, over to you.
Thank you, Natalia and colleagues. I'll be brief because we just have 5-6 minutes left. There was one specific question to me about whether the Modern Slavery Act in Australia applies the children lens. In my view, it applies that in a very limited manner. If you look at the definition of modern slavery, it makes reference to children and the instruments relevant to them. So I think that we can say is a lens that is applied there. But if you look at what is expected in terms of reporting, what is expected in terms of due diligence or remediation for that matter, that lens is completely missing. And we also don't, connecting it to Natalia, your point about intersectionality, we should not assume that all children are the same. Children of indigenous peoples in Australia are very different from children of others communities, right? So how the Modern Slavery Act could incorporate this sensitivity as well. And if Australian companies are operating, let us say, in the Pacific, where are indigenous peoples there, how the children of those indigenous peoples in those countries outside Australia are going to be impacted, and how should they be engaged in all this? So I think that issue is very, very crucial. I think there was another question from James about how difficult it is to convince companies to take the rights of the children seriously, especially if the governments are adopting a tokenistic approach. I think, James, there is no one yes or no, difficult or not difficult. I would say it varies from sector to sector and companies to company based on my experience. And I think the other thing that I've heard so many times, not just from companies, but from all stakeholders, is this, that if the children are not working, they will be worse off. Let us face this reality. Why are some of the children are forced to work or even sent by their parents to work? That goes back to my earlier point about not getting living wage. People are not able to survive. They're not able to get 2 meals a day. So those children are really desperate, and sometimes they may not even have any parents or caregiver. They're just street children in many parts of the global South, right? That is a very stark reality which is there. And my last point for now is, I do not believe this narrow approach of Modern Slavery Act, which is adopted in Australia, is the right way to go. We should go for a more comprehensive human rights holistic due diligence, because this legislation is creating an impractical compartment. You're telling companies that if you find anything else, ignore it. We are only interested in modern slavery. This is now not how it works. Before a company can report, they have to do human rights due diligence. And in that process, they may find environmental pollution. They may find sexual harassment. They may find something else. So you are saying report about modern slavery, and what about other things that you find in that process? So this is a wrong approach. And of course, we need penalties. There was another question on that. That's my personal view. But let's see what other colleagues think. Thank you.
Thank you, Surya. And yes, you touch on a number of questions from the chat area. One in relation to exactly that governments don't do often enough themselves, but yet at the same time, they expect businesses to do much more, which I think is and has been problematic. The UK Modern Slavery Act initially did not capture public sector, which I always found bizarre, at least. And the other aspect is about penalties. So can I invite, we have a couple of minutes, literally a couple of minutes left. Can I invite Ida and Kylie to very briefly comment on those two aspects? The role of public bodies, the role of government in ensuring they're doing the right thing and setting the standards that then they expect from business sector, and the second on, I think I know where I'll be going, but whether penalties are important and whether that should be part of the revised Modern Slavery Act. Ida, would you like to go first?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, sorry, just with the 2 minutes left. I mean, I think it can't be overstated the importance of having all relevant stakeholders involved, ranging from the government, business, to the investors, the board members, recognizing that unless children's rights are made visible in all mechanisms and measures supporting and require responsible business conduct, they will simply be overlooked in the implementation. So it really requires visibility, includes recognition that business can have this adverse impact on the full range of children's rights, not just child labor. And of course, and as Surya just mentioned, it does require, of course, the need to look at the entire range of mandatory human rights due diligence, which is needed to ensure that children's rights can be realized and that they can access their rights. But I think this is such the balance between the public sector, the private sector, and the role of course, the investors as well. It's a mix that we're still trying to grapple and tackle. But as long as we keep pushing this agenda and ensuring that the guidance is available for all, to implement this, that is really what it is so important. Sorry, over to for the last comments.
Thank you, Ida. Kylie?
Thanks, Ida. Look, I definitely agree. It's a whole stakeholder approach, and it's very narrow to only include one sort of area of society. Government absolutely have a responsibility to protect human rights, and that includes child rights. I don't disagree with Soraya that there's a lot of work that needs to be done in the Modern Slavery Act. I will note that the Modern Slavery Act was enacted in 2018. We've now got the opportunity to review that act, and there will be a very strong consultation process. Human rights, environmental due diligence has come up time and time again in Australia. We're obviously watching the EU's moves in that space very closely. I dare say that there are a lot of voices out there who agree that there should be hefty penalties, and what does hefty penalties actually mean, because we've seen in the past that even penalties don't always work as a deterrent for business. So I think there's lots of opportunities for us to enhance that act. I also think there's lots of opportunities in Australia to consider broadening our approach to human rights, and whether that's also a national action plan on human rights and not just one confined to modern slavery and human trafficking. Perhaps that's something that can be discussed in the future, as well as a charter of human rights. But again, I think, it's something that we're engaging with businesses on, that we're talking to businesses on. It's definitely not a closed door. Businesses have an openness and a willingness to discuss human rights and the S in ESG a lot more than what they have 3 or 4 years ago. And so I think it's about taking the positives and continuing on that positive step, but just not expecting things to happen at a rate of knots.
Thank you so much, Kylie. Unfortunately, this is all we have time for. I think we could easily have another hour or 2 hours. And thank you so much for all of you who posted comments and questions. I do apologize for not being able to address all of those. But I think the conversation really, it kind of goes to the direction that in the end of the day, it is about, it is a learning curve for everyone. It is about knowing where we're going, but at the same time, making sure that we can get there by setting standards and expectations at the level that actually can be achieved, rather than setting it to fail. And also a number of issues which we didn't have much time to touch on, but which are very important, is the climate change, the business operations in relation to climate change, and how it affects children as well. And Surya did mention about really, if you look beyond modern slavery, in order to achieve SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, we have to ensure that all stakeholders, especially the most marginalized, and children often are the most marginalized groups, are part of this conversation. So I'm just gonna finish off by paraphrasing a Native American saying, that we do not inherit Earth from our ancestors, we simply borrow it from the future generations. And I think this is probably captures our conversation today, and therefore this is not whether children should be part of the conversation, is how to involve children in the conversation to ensure that the voices are heard. Thank you so much to our experts today, Professor Surya Deva, Ida Hillstead, and Kylie Porter, for the time and generosity in sharing their experiences. I would like to thank also those at DTP for the work behind the scenes to make sure the webinar could take place, and also for hosting the series on children's rights, which is obviously extremely important. Once again, I would like to emphasize, thank you so much to our wonderful audience for your active participation and willingness to engage in this important topic of the role of business in protecting children's human rights. And I would also like you all to invite you to the next webinar in the series, which will be focusing on children's rights strategic litigation. Thank you, kia ora from me, and goodbye.
Bye, everyone.